So we're delighted to have you here with us today to engage with Professor Cousins and the work he and colleagues have been doing, including some of you probably online, to derive and promulgate a set of evidence-based principles to guide collaborative approaches to evaluation. Brad's a professor emeritus of evaluation at the Faculty of Education, and as I mentioned, he's the past director of CRECS. And of course, we all know he's an internationally recognized scholar in evaluation, known for his contributions to participatory and collaborative approaches to the use and capacity building of evaluation findings and knowledge.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's my great pleasure to be here. Certainly the lunch-hour colloquium for CRECS has evolved, I think mostly due to exigencies arising from the pandemic. Well, it's my great pleasure to talk to you guys today about, really it's a research program that we're going to talk about. Our program on developing and promulgating evidence-based principles to guide collaborative approaches to evaluation. Now, the thing about this is there's some people online here who've heard a lot about this before, or maybe they've been fairly directly involved. So there'll be some aspects of this, I'm sure, that'll be a bit old news for folks. But for many people here, I believe, this could be an introduction to the principles. So what I'm going to try to do is first of all, we're going to start out with some background, which I think is important. And then we're going to get to the inception, development, and the launch issues. And we're going to cover those fairly quickly because, again, we've talked about that on other occasions. And in fact, there's a video in the CRECS Knowledge Mobilization Collection, the 10-minute window collection, that talks about these three elements. So I want to try to get to the new stuff, like what's new under the sun, and many people coming today are probably interested in that. I'm going to talk about field trials that we've run, and then some other observations I have to make about diffusion of the principles and where they seem to be going. And we'll end up with some thoughts about where do we go from here. So first of all, I want to start out with what is it? Well, what is that image we're looking at? Without the caption there, I think you would be hard-pressed to identify it. It's a sliced banana under a microscope. But in some ways, collaborative approaches to evaluation are probably also quite difficult to sort of see. And so really the root definition or the root defining feature of collaborative approaches is trained evaluators working in tandem or in partnership in many cases with program community members, sometimes we say stakeholders, to produce evaluation knowledge. So they're working as a team, it's a co-production function there. I remember when I started University of Ottawa a long time ago in the 90s, there was a thesis committee I was on, Werner Meyer. He did a study in sub-Saharan Africa, and he looked at 11 participatory research studies in sub-Saharan Africa in the education sector. And what we were all really struck by was in those 11 studies, there was very little evidence that they were in fact participatory. Maybe people served in the role of providing data, but they weren't really part of the co-creation of knowledge. So that's, I think, a really important consideration to keep in mind moving ahead. When do we use it? Well, evaluation is used for a lot of reasons, including accountability, justifications, trying to ensure that resources are being managed appropriately and so on. But if we're going beyond impact, I think that this is where we can think about appropriate uses for collaborative approaches, because you don't have the heavy requirement for independence or impartial evaluation. Formative or summary formative approaches to evaluation, it's all about understanding that the initiative or the program is going to continue but that it can be improved, and maybe evaluation can help do that. Developmental evaluation is an approach to evaluation where, in fact, a program doesn't yet exist, but people get together to come up with ideas about innovative solutions to complex social, economic, health, or community or educational programs or problems. So in developmental evaluation, there's a role for CAE, I believe, also. And then, of course, when we think about, using evaluation in a transformational context, helping, trying to work with people who are disadvantaged in some way and engaging them directly in the evaluation process to help them to, ameliorate social inequities and, develop self-determination. So that's another certainly opportunity, I think, to apply collaborative approaches. Why do we use it? Well, historically, our justifications for using collaborative approaches to evaluation have focused on the 3 Ps here. And it's only been very recently through work with my good friend and colleague, Jill Chouinard, that we embrace the notion of the 7 Rs. So the 3 Ps, these are sources of consideration for justifying doing a collaborative approach to evaluation. It could be pragmatic. It's practical, it's problem solving. We want to use evaluation information to help improve the program. It could be philosophical, which is more epistemological, and it's all about trying to understand complex phenomena at deeper levels than we're able to do through traditional approaches. Or it could be political, such as I mentioned in a social justice context, where we want to use transformational perspectives to try to help people develop a better sense of self-determination. So any given project can draw from all 3 of those, and maybe it's going to be heavily weighted toward 1 out of the 3, but certainly all 3 of those factor into our justifications for doing collaborative approaches. But in addition to that, we have ethical considerations. And this conversation started a few years ago with a colleague in Israel, Miri Levin-Rosales, and it's distinct from the political justification. And Jill Chouinard and I look quite closely at this, and Jill has a lot of resources to bring to this problem. And we really did a great job, I think, of developing an explicated sense of what the underlying or undergirding ethical considerations could be and how those factor in as justification for doing collaborative evaluation. What does it look like in practice? We've boiled it down to these 3 fundamental dimensions, and there you can think of them as Likert scales, a scale from one end to the other. So the first one is control of technical decision making. Is the evaluator in control of that? Are the involved stakeholders, program community members, or is it a balance of the 2? Secondly, diversity among the stakeholders who are involved. Is it limited to just those who have power to make decisions about the program, or does it involve even the intended beneficiaries of the program, or is there a balance there? And finally, what do we mean by engaging program community members in the evaluation? Is it just light touch consultation, or does it get much deeper in terms of the evaluation methodological spectrum? Are we involving people in all aspects of the evaluation methodology? And we can use this 3-dimensional tool or device to differentiate different forms of collaborative approaches to evaluation along those dimensions. So that's what it can more or less look like in practice. Well, who contributes what? If we have a partnership happening, different partners bring different knowledge and expertise to the table. So evaluators, obviously, they're very strong in evaluation logic and methods and standards of practice. But they have some knowledge of the program theory and how the program is supposed to function, and they have some knowledge of the program context, but compared to program community partners, their knowledge is kind of limited in that respect. Whereas the program community members, I mean, they live in that context and they're working with the program on a regular basis. So they have a much richer sense of what's going on there. And they may have some good knowledge about evaluation logic and methods. For example, in the education sector, I've worked on many projects involving teachers and school administrators as program community members, and many of them have done master's programs and they've done research methods programs, so they have some access to knowledge there. Well, back to our trajectory. So I want to sort of frame this as a trajectory of a research program. So what we're going to talk about today is our research program on collaborative approaches to evaluation. Prior to 2012, a lot of our own work was on evaluation use and participatory evaluation, but it kind of morphed into serious thinking about collaborative approaches and principles over the years, basically starting in 2012. So we're going to run through, again, these first three elements fairly quickly, and then we're going to get to the field trials and the diffusion aspects. Well, here's our illustrious team that have been involved pretty much from the get-go. It was actually my colleague Lynn Shula from Queen's University and Bessa Whitmore from Carleton University and myself who really got things underway way back in 2012 or so. And we started thinking about collaborative approaches and how we can maybe move things forward in that field. And then later on, Natalie Gilbert and Hind Al-Hadib joined us. Both of them have graduated now from the University of Ottawa, so they're PhDs. Alejandro, many of you will recognize Alejandro Gomez, was the longtime coordinator at CRECS, and he was very involved in the technical aspects of our research program. We called ourselves the COVE research team. That's collaborative opportunities to value evaluation, but really it also corresponds to a place we used to meet called the Cove Inn, which is in southeastern Ontario. Well, collaborative approaches to evaluation, it's really an umbrella term and it covers so many different approaches, and we can see a whole array of them here, and probably this is a non-exhaustive list. But the idea is that many of these approaches have been burgeoning over the years. And what our position is, we need to think about, what sort of commonalities do they have? They have that basic commonality of evaluators working in partnership with stakeholders. But what other things do we need to think about in order to do good quality work? Now, many of these are actually by definition collaborative, but some of them, such as contribution analysis and utilization focused evaluation, they can be very much participatory or collaborative, but they don't necessarily have to be, whereas others, are, as I've said, are by definition of that sort. So our basic perspective here is that rather than thinking about, there's all these different types out there, how do we differentiate these different types? We don't really see that as a really the important question to ask, because the way we see it is you need to, first of all, decide whether a collaborative approach is appropriate. And in order to do that, you have to do a very thorough analysis of context. And when you do a thorough analysis of context, you come up with what are the purposes of the evaluation and what's it going to look like in practice. So if there's a call for an evaluation, we need to analyze at a fairly rich level, what are the contextual exigencies and what are the demands, what are the information needs, what's the history of the program, what's the what are some of the factors impinging on the program? And should we actually do a collaborative approach? And if we should, what should be our main focus in terms of purpose? So there are groups out there. I'm thinking of David Fetterman and Liliana Campos Rodriguez and others who are really much taken by this notion of trying to differentiate among specific members of this family. For example, collaborative evaluation, participatory evaluation, and empowerment evaluation. But we like to shy away from that because we think there's many, many more members of the family, and we're not sure if it makes sense to sort of identify with particular approaches as opposed to just picking an approach that makes sense given the contextual needs that are presenting. And other groups out there, Marv Alkin and some of his students at UCLA, they looked at trying to model different approaches to evaluation for theoretical reasons. That is to say, to make evaluation theory more explicit and more accessible. And they tried this out with participatory evaluation. And in fact, I was kind of involved as a sort of bystander in that project. And a concern that I have there is that, you can't really look at it as a model so much, because to me, a model implies a prototype. So here's the prototype, and we need to just put this into action. And really, participatory collaborative approaches, they're much more fluid and flexible and context dependent. And it's not to say that the structural approach of a model can't be context sensitive, but there's a risk there, I guess. So this is our general approach, is figure out what the needs are and kind of go from there. Well, when we designed and developed the principles, we had an empirical process in place. There were 4 phases to it. We're not going to go through these in any detail at all. But the foundational methodological element was, we asked practicing evaluators who practice collaborative approaches to evaluation to think about, a successful project, and success was defined in their own terms. So think about that and then answer some questions on it. And we got qualitative and quantitative responses. Then we had them think about a project you worked on in the last 3 years that was far less successful than hoped. And give us, for each of those, part of the data we collected, give us the top 3 reasons why it was far less successful than hoped, or why it was successful. That was the basis of our methodology. And that's how we generated qualitative data that led to the development of the principles. Most of the work happened here in phase 3. We had 320 practicing evaluators complete our online survey, and that generated an amazing amount of rich data. And then we had a follow-up phase, which was a validation phase. And here we are. We developed this set of 8 principles. There are 4 things we need to keep in mind when we think about these principles. And first of all, maybe there's lots more than 4, but first of all, principles to guide collaborative approaches to evaluation. Yes, they can be used for that. They should be used for that, but they can be used for other purposes as well. So the first thing we need to consider is we believe that we should use this framework as a set. It's a set of principles. It's not a pick and choose menu. Okay. The second observation we can make is that they're interconnected, and that's what we mean by these dotted lines. So each of these principles overlaps with one another and with the others. Thirdly, they're in a loose temporal order. So you might say it kind of starts about here and it kind of works its way around to follow through to realize use. But in fact, it's iterative, and it's not meant to be a lockstep order here. It's iterative, and you can go back to any one of these principles at any time during the evaluation process. And then the final thing is that there are, some people would argue that, well, something like monitor and respond to resource availability, that happens with any evaluation, not just collaborative approaches, or monitor evaluation progress and quality. That happens with any evaluation. But the point we want to make here is that we put a particular spin on these things in that they're collaboration specific. So for example, resource availability in a collaborative approach has everything to do with keeping people from the program community engaged, because it's a human resource issue. And it's, if they start falling off, then it becomes non-collaborative. Same thing with evaluating progress and monitoring quality. This is where the evaluator brings knowledge of evaluation logic and method and standards of practice, but the evaluator needs to ensure and maybe educate program community members about these principles and make sure that they understand them and bring. So you see, they're all collaboration specific, even though some of these things may apply to any evaluation. Some of them obviously are linked directly to collaborative approaches. So you start here, we talk about, why should we do a collaborative approach in the first place? And I've already shared with you the justifications that may be considered. Then it's about, fostering meaningful relationships, moving to developing a shared understanding what the program looks like, what is it that we're trying to evaluate, promoting appropriate processes. And by that, what we mean is it's a three-dimensional diagram that we shared with you. We've already talked about, these other two. Promoting evaluative thinking, and that's kind of developing a culture of evaluation within the organization or within the program. And finally, follow through to realize use. And by use, we don't just mean using data to make decisions or to improve the program, but also a transformative sense to that. Following through that to make sure that the transformative kinds of outcomes you're trying to shoot for are in fact taking place. So I'm not going to go in great detail about these, but I'm just going to show you, one of these up close. So here we have the principle, and these are the important dimensions that impinge on this principle arising from our evidence base. So we look at a description of each principle, in this case, why we're going to use CAE in the first place, and understanding the choice to collaborate. So what actions can people take? Thorough assessment and documentation examination of who are the important stakeholders and just what are their interests and what do they value, and how do we know whether or not we've addressed these things? Well, we can look at to what extent is there agreement among the information needs among the different stakeholders. Remember, stakeholders, it's a broad group. It's not just a uniform, homogeneous group. There are many different actors there with different access to power and so on. Then there's a consistent goal embracement, that everybody is on board with the goals of the program. It's not something that's contested, really. And also, are we embracing appropriate purposes of the program? So we've done some writing about this. I mean, we have a little brochure document that kind of puts it in a nutshell, so to speak. But more recently, with my colleague Hind Al-Hudab, we're working on a chapter in a book that's going to be coming out. And we're making a theoretical sort of connection to, we're looking at how do we move from the theoretical kind of aspect of collaborative approaches and principles to observe, getting them into practice. And that's the focus of that chapter. And these elements are very much part of that. So I'm not going to go through that for every chapter, for every principle. That information is available to people if they're interested. Well, what are the suggested applications of the principles? Okay, first and foremost, the principles, it's a guide to planning and framing and doing collaborative approach to evaluation. So that's the main interest. But as you can see, there are many other possible applications. For example, the framework could be used for the retrospective analysis and critique of a project that already happened. We could do more or less of a post-mortem, so to speak, or an after-the-fact review and try to learn from that and figure out how we could do things better moving forward. They can be used for design and delivery of education and training or for pedagogical purposes. They could be used for review and development of evaluation policy. They can also be used for cross-cultural field building. That's another possibility. And finally, framing research on evaluation. Of course, research on evaluation is something that I've always been highly interested and engaged with, and almost routinely, the approach that we take to research, we have a conceptual framework in mind, and we help that to guide the research. So that's another possibility for the set of principles. Well, we launched the principles in 2017, and we launched them in English, French, and Spanish. So we invested some resources in developing those. And by the way, this was funded through resources at the University of Ottawa and some other contributions, in-kind contributions. But so we developed these, the principles and the practical resources with them, and we launched them globally 2017. We did that through every network we could think about in terms of evaluation, and there are many. And we did this globally. We can see also with the little red stars that are appearing in North America, South America, and Europe, and the Middle East, and even Southeast Asia. We can see that we've also done promotional activities in the form of workshops or short courses or some kind of in-country sort of presentation and engagement with people from an instructional point of view. So lots of effort and energy has gone into trying to promote the principles over the last number of years. Well, now we get to the field trials, and this is a project that we completed with the publication of this book last year, 2020. And we put out a call for interest in doing field studies. And we sent that call through all of the networks that I've already mentioned. And in the end, and we had an editorial board, and in the end, we selected 8 studies in Canada. 8 studies that came from collaborative approaches to evaluations that were being implemented in Canada, in the United States, in Costa Rica, England, Spain, and Israel. So we had quite a range of different groups working on implementing the principles or at least using them. And these were in the education sector, both higher education as well as K-12. They were in the community development sector as well as in the health sector and international development. So the main objectives of the field trials, we wanted to get a sense of what kind of variation in application do we have. And we also wanted to look at what are the contributions of these field trials to the collaborative approach to evaluation, empirical knowledge base. And finally, we were looking for suggestions for the impending review of the principles. I should add that the 8 principles that I've shared with you in the structure and the framework that we've shared, we look at this, even though it's gone through some validation, we look at this as kind of the preliminary perspective and something that's subject to review on an ongoing basis, and ultimately we may revise that. So doing the field test is one way that we can get at that, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. So in terms of, from the field studies, in terms of the applications, We had a couple of retrospective field studies where authors or groups took a look at something they've already completed and took a sort of a rear view mirror look at it and used the principles to help them analyze it and discuss what worked and what didn't and how they could do it better. Some of those included elements of proactive use of principles. In other words, they may have collected a little bit of data while the evaluation was ongoing. 5 of the studies published in the book were actually research studies on collaborative approaches to evaluation that looked at different perspectives and different issues, including engagement, including community development issues and management, including how do we enhance the use of evaluation through collaborative approaches. So there were a number of interesting field applications there that were guided by the principles. 2 of the chapters were on pedagogical applications in the higher education sector, one at an undergraduate level and one at a graduate level. And finally, there was a study done by colleagues who have been working in IDRC-funded projects in the international development sector for quite a while. And they have their own framework called the DESI, Development, Evaluation, Communication, something or other, I'm sorry. Anyway, they come up with their own set of principles independently. And what they did was take a very close look at how the CAE principles compared with theirs. It was like a convergent validity study. Missing from the book are much more of an emphasis on proactive applications. I mean, the principles are designed to guide practice in collaborative approaches to evaluation. And really, I think the book is a bit lacking in that respect. We had some elements of that in there, but that was kind of missing. And also missing, nobody really took a good look at policy analysis. Evaluation policies are certainly important, and organizations are either developing them or renewing them all the time. And it seems like a collaborative element could be worthwhile to include in those. So that's what describes what the book looked at. And then how do we frame the key contributions from the book? Well, first of all, we can talk about what are the contributions to the collaborative evaluation knowledge base. There's a lot of information. We do a review and integration of the chapters from the book about relationship building and how developing relationships between evaluators and program community members is so essential in order to leverage use. And so several of the chapters kind of got at that one way or another. Another contribution is the methodological considerations. In the evaluation domain, a lot of the empirical research that's going on is very much wedded to this perspective of the reflective case narrative, usually written by evaluators, based on a real life project that they've been engaged with. But the trouble with the reflective narrative is that we don't have established ways to assess the validity of those in the way that we do with other approaches to empirical inquiry. So this book brings a range of different methodologies to the question of, how do we actually inquire into collaborative approaches to evaluation. And so I would say the book helped to sort of raise the bar a little bit, but also I think there's some deficiencies there in terms of, there wasn't much in the way of quantitative elements, but there could be at some point. The book also, I think, shared some interesting insights into pedagogical benefits of using the principles and how they can stimulate ongoing discussion and dialogue within a learning environment, and how they can help people bring their own perspective and share that with others and talk about it in a collaborative way. So there are many pedagogical benefits, I think, that surfaced as well. There were some principle-specific findings and implication. We talked a lot about validity, and we talked a lot about how most of the chapters, I think, really contributed to helping to underscore that the principles are actually working and that they're useful and that they can help to deepen our understanding about what collaborative approaches to evaluation means and how it can be used. So there's lots of elements from a lot of the chapters that really contributed to that sort of understanding. We found that there's also contributions in terms of in-context uses. We found that the principles were useful in different cultural contexts, including South America and Spain and the Middle East. And we found that they were really helpful to engage with stakeholders at the local level and to draw from their perspectives and expertise to help shape things. There were also benefits from the principles, both to evaluators as well as instructional kinds of benefits. Evaluators would benefit from the point of view of learning about their own practice. Helping the principles helped evaluators, there's a little bit of evidence, to become more reflective practitioners and think about their own practice in terms of collaboration. And the pedagogical benefits had to do with ideas about how they could go ahead and think about instructing others and educating others using the principles. Some issues for considerations. We identified some specifications for concrete action. I think a lot of it has to do with how can we move the principles forward in a practical way. I think there was some concern among the authors that the principles are still a little bit academic or vague and not really as accessible as they might be. So there was a real push for more practical sort of actions or activities or resources that could help to bring them to that point. There were some principle-specific issues. Some principles were sort of questioned or at least looked upon in a different light. One of them, I think from the DESI study, where they were talking about organizational readiness for evaluation, which is one of the principles that they felt was important. And they kind of implied that might be a missing or implicit principle for the collaborative approach to evaluation. In retrospect, we were thinking maybe considering whether or not a collaborative approach is the approach we should take in the first place, which is the first principle, is to make sure that you're doing a collaborative approach for the correct reasons. Maybe organizational readiness is part of that. In any case, we got a lot of valuable information, I think, out of these field tests. And we're quite happy moving forward. So I'm going to wrap up fairly quickly here, but I just wanted to comment on some aspects of diffusion. First of all, there's a group in Argentina, South America, actually, that have developed this marvelous website called Evaluators Participativa. And in that website, it's the whole purpose is evaluation field building. And it's, developing a participatory evaluation learning community. And I'm pleased to see that folks in this network have embraced our principles and that they've, taken them and integrated them into some of their own activities. Excuse me. There are some pedagogical applications that we observe or will observe. One of them is an online module. It's part of a really interesting set of modules and evaluation that's going to be developed for a non-credit approach for helping evaluators access different theoretical perspectives in evaluation. And I'm very pleased to say that Western Michigan University elected to include collaborative approaches to evaluation as one of the modules in that suite. And in fact, I was happy to help them have a look at that and try to, tweak that a bit and make sure it's ready to go. I think that's going to be starting maybe next fall. This is a fairly recently developed instructional module and looking pretty good. Another possibility is a 2-day short course with the Evaluators Institute. I've got this in brackets because at this point I have a verbal agreement with Claremont Graduate University, and I do believe it's going to happen. It's going to be in July, and then there'll be another 2-day one in, I think, October, and then the following March. So it looks like CAE may be integrated into the suite of really interesting content available through the Evaluators Institute. There's all kinds of ongoing research on evaluation. Here's just a few examples. I mean, we got an email about 3 weeks ago from an EdD student working on her dissertation, wanting to have permission to use one of our figures because her work has been very much informed by our framework, and she wanted to include that in her dissertation. There have been a range of publications. Jeremy Acree published an article in Canadian Journal of Program Evaluation. Lynn Shula and her colleagues published a book on stakeholder perspectives and growing the knowledge-based book, which came out in 2019. And Barbara Ciarto and colleagues looked at the relationship of CAE to knowledge mobilization. Michelle Searle and her colleagues looked at CAE in the context of developmental evaluation. That should be developmental evaluation. So there's lots of ongoing research on evaluation about which we're aware, but I took a look at what's happening more broadly or more globally. So this is the Web of Science. Did a quick look here. You can see that the main article publication of our principles is the one that led by Lynn Shula, where we introduced the principles in the American Journal of Evaluation. So I focused on that one. Since it was published in 2016, there have been 36 citations of the principles or of that article. And from those 36 citations, there have been 112 citations and 104 different articles have cited the ones that cited our article. So we can see quite a bit of activity that's kind of flowing. I mean, to what extent do these things focus on CAE principles? It's probably quite questionable, but it's good to know that things are moving in directions of that sort. Here we can also see that of those 104 articles, they're published in all kinds of different sectors: social sciences, education, health, management, environment. So it's important to understand that not only is evaluation multidisciplinary, but the collaborative approaches to evaluation are used in multidisciplinary contexts as well. Finally, this is from the ResearchGate social media network, and we can see that we've got 49 citations of this particular piece, and I would say that most of those would be refereed journal articles, but not all of them. Well, where do we go from here? Well, there's going to be ongoing promotion and capacity building. In addition to the TEI, the Evaluators Institute, we have a proposal accepted to give a one-day workshop at the European Evaluation Society meeting. Whenever that happens, hopefully that's going to be in the fall of next year. And then I think another focus for our attention ought to be something that came out of the book, focusing on practical resources and try to develop resources or a manual or something that can really help groups to put these principles into practice. So that's another consideration. And then maybe another book. I've got 2 question marks there. One is because my wife tells me that I'm not really retired, and I'm not so sure about that observation, but in any case, time is an issue. But in thinking about another book, the idea would be having a targeted focus on proactive use of planning, framing, and guiding, CAE. And that's the piece that was missing from the first book. Also, looking at things from the point of view of stakeholders. Lynn Shula in her chapter did an amazing job of bringing that lens to this whole prospect. And it's one of the rare studies that have been done of that sort. It's difficult to do them, but that would be a good focus, I think, for moving forward. And finally, I think this book would culminate in a revised edition of the principles based on the accumulating empirical research, not just from our field studies, but also from some independent studies that appear to be popping up. So that's more or less what we're thinking about in terms of moving forward. Just for your information, and I can make these slides available. Peter, maybe you can help me tell people how they'll get access to them. But I've included, because we're talking about a research program here, I've included a list of publications that have come out of this research program. Of course, we're still generating content as we move forward, and we will hopefully continue to do so for some time. So thank you very much for your attention and your participation in this session. And it's my great pleasure to entertain a few questions or comments at this point.